Today on BRStv, we're dodging tank disasters. Hey guys, my name is Ryan. Welcome to another week of the BRS160, where every week we do our best to help you guys, members of the reefing community, enjoy your tanks and find new ways to explore the hobby. We do that by following the setup and progression of this 160-gallon reef tank. This week we were going to cover fish illness, but we had a pretty close call with the tank this week where we skirted disaster, so we decided to move up recovering from tank disasters up a week. We'll cover my stupid mistake and then some other common disasters and what to do in each case. Last week I was doing some maintenance on the two-part dosers before shooting some video, and I needed to prime the dosers when I was done to fill the tubes back up with two-part solution. To do that, I turned the timers which control our dosers from auto to on. Normally I would have turned them off in 5 minutes once the tubes were full, but I got distracted and walked away, which was about 3 p.m. Normally a pH alarm would have gone off to let me know that I was overdosing the elk component, but we ended the controller portion of the BRS160 right before my son was born. And I've been playing catch up ever since I got back, so I haven't had a chance to install one, meaning none of the safety triggers I would have set up were around to warn me. If that wasn't bad enough, I also recently changed my email to try and escape the hundreds of spam emails I get every day, and I forgot to update the Senai with the new email address, meaning I didn't get the reminder to change my slide out and the corresponding pH alarms as well. More or less the tank was completely unprotected. Fast forward 14 hours and I woke up in sheer panic. The moment I opened my eyes, I knew what I had done and the doses are still running. I got to work about 6 a.m. and sure enough, the BRS160 was covered in precipitate and cloudy white. There were a couple of things that saved the tank. First, the BRS doser's ultra-slow dosing rate of 1.1 milliliter a minute, which is ideal for dosing chemicals like this, but it's also a limiting factor, meaning that even though they were on for 15 hours, they still only dosed 1,000 milliliters of each solution. In theory, that should have brought my calcium from 420 to like 470, which likely isn't going to cause a major issue, but the alkalinity should have skyrocketed from 8 all the way up to 15, and the pH should have rocketed right with it, which absolutely is going to stress the corals out pretty substantially, ranging anywhere from loss of coloration, tissue loss, or even mortality. However, when I arrived, pH was in an acceptable range, calcium just slightly high, and alkalinity close to 12, which is high, but these numbers are what Red Sea's Coral Pro Black Bucket mixes up to normally. I believe the only reason I didn't have more serious issues is because I didn't leave just the alkalinity doser on by itself. By leaving both on, half of it precipitated out almost immediately and avoided some of the more serious issues. In fact, the tremendous amount of precipitation crystals was actually causing the alkalinity and calcium to drop fairly rapidly after I turned the dosers off. These fresh crystals strongly attract additional calcium and carbonate ions and pull them out of solution. When you're in a situation like this, you're kind of stuck between two sets of conflicting advice. One, where chemistry changes or fixes should be done slowly or you risk shocking your corals. And the second piece of advice of getting the tank back to normal quickly to limit the coral's exposure to poor water chemistry. Each case is different, but my general advice is if the tank is in a safe range at the moment, go slower. In this case, maybe a reasonable water change would get the alkalinity a bit closer to the range that the corals are accustomed to, and then let them drop on their own. However, all the precipitation was the bigger issue here, so we did a 70% water change, which got the elk back down to 9 and removed a majority of the precipitate, which seems to stabilize everything. A couple of frags lost some color, but other than that, we skirted major disaster by the skin of our teeth. Immediately following that, I spent the entire day installing a controller and getting the Senai notifying me properly. To be honest, I hadn't decided which controller to use yet, but the only one we had in stock is the Apex, and we already had a mounting board made for it, so I think fate decided for us. While I was at it, I decided to upgrade to the dosing pump, which is an awesome doser if you own an Apex, much easier to set up than a digital timer, and makes it easy to spread your dose out over a much larger period of time. End of story, the tank is safe, but on a long enough timeline, most of us are going to make a mistake. Redundancy and alarms will help us catch them, but what do we do after? That's the focus of today's episode. We're going to focus on what to do when any major piece of the life support system has failed with power, salinity, pH and chemistry, temperature, food, light, and even the tank itself. Starting with power, since power is at the heart of the life support system, without power, everything fails. There are two types of power outages, with less than 24 hours and more than 24 hours. I'd say 95% of the outages fall into the less than 24 hours, and luckily pretty easy to deal with. For the most part, with an outage like this, the only major concern is water movement and gas exchange. So the priority is getting some power heads going, which will break the surface tension of the water to promote gas exchange and get oxygen throughout the entire tank. If you're lucky enough to own some DC controllable Tunses, Ecotex Vortex, or MaxSpec gyres, they all have a battery backup option which automatically turns on the moment the power goes out. This is pretty nice because 3/4 of the day most of us are either at work or sleeping and don't know when the power goes out. Outside of that, the most cost-effective solution is a simple $20 inverter, which can hook up to your car's battery and an extension cord to run to your power heads. Generators are obviously an option as well, but because of the cost, space, and maintenance, for most people, they're just a nice to have. One thing to keep in mind is they only work if you maintain them, so if you buy one for this purpose, make sure to change the oil and spark plugs as needed. This is where we cross over to over 24-hour outages, which can be anywhere from a day to a week. Your tank can run just fine without light for a week. Keep in mind that there are week-long storms in the ocean all the time, so this isn't uncommon for them. The only real concern now is heating the tank and flow. At this point, a generator is pretty much required. If you got hit by a big storm and you know most of the city is out and will be for a while, get on your phone and find a big box retailer which will allow you to buy a generator online with in-store pickup. The limited amount of stock they're going to have is going to last less than an hour because there's 100,000 people in the city that are all going after the same 20 generators. You might have to drive pretty far outside of your area to get one. This is why if you have the extra cash, buying one beforehand is wise, especially if you live in an area with common outages or storms. You can also ask your friends or even local reef club. Most reef clubs have dozens of people who own generators and would loan them to anyone in need, even if they've never met you before. Even better than all that is a natural gas generator which kicks on the moment an outage happens. Power outages for your family and tank are a thing of the past. Okay, let's talk salinity disaster, which in 90% of the cases is caused by a failed auto top-off with a huge reservoir. It's only a handful of points off. Don't freak out. Just add some salt water, let the tank evaporate, and it will rise gradually. However, if your salinity is really low, you're going to have to find a way to get the salinity back up rapidly. The best way is a huge water change, like 50% minimum, but most people won't have that much heated salt water on hand, so that's not a realistic solution in most cases. If you have enough for a 30% change, you can consider making a batch of very high salinity water to do that change with, which will help. If you have limited to no water on hand, I think your best bet is to turn off your return pump to isolate your sump and bring the salinity of the sump's water up pretty drastically. You might get some precipitation in the sump, but that's not a major concern at this point. Mix it vigorously until you're sure it's all dissolved. I'd like to give it at least an hour, but depending on how low your tank salinity is or how it looks, you'll have to make a judgment call there. Once it is dissolved, turn the return pump back on, let it circulate with the tank, test and repeat as necessary. You don't need to get the salinity all the way back up. If you don't have a sump, you could do something similar by removing some of the water, raising the salinity in a bucket, and then adding it back to the tank. In relation to that is overall pH and chemistry issues, which are most commonly caused by a failed calcium and alkalinity system, including Kalkwasser two-parter calcium reactor, the most common being a failed auto top-off, which has Kalkwasser mixed in. In this case, salinity is just a minor concern, and the real issue is the pH is sky high. If it's just a few tenths of a point high, I would let it drop on its own. Higher than that, and I would start to consider dosing distilled vinegar to get it back down. Maybe a teaspoon or tablespoon at a time at first until you get an idea of how the vinegar interacts with your tank's pH. A little goes a long way. If you had a major calc overdose in the multiple of gallons, your pH could likely be 9, 10, or even higher, and the tank is probably milky white. This is an area where getting it down fast, like immediately trumps slow adjustments for sure. I think every reefer who doses calc or soda ash should have a bottle of vinegar around just for this reason. So if you don't, go out and buy one now. It's $1, and when you need it, you'll be happy you did. Luckily with Kalkwasser, you added equal amounts of calcium and alkalinity, so while both might be very high, they should be in balance. If it is really high, large water changes are the only way to get it down. If they're still close to a safe range, you might want to let them fall on their own. Testing frequently is critical, like multiple times a day at first. Similar advice applies to soda ash and overdoses of the alkalinity component of the two-part. If the pH is slightly high, leave it alone. If it's really high, use vinegar to get it down. However, in this case, you now have sky-high alkalinity and the precipitation is probably plummeting your calcium as well. The only way to get the alkalinity down is time or water changes. To bring them both back into balance with each other, all the precipitate floating around is going to be somewhat of a challenge and require a lot of testing to stay on top of it. I would again recommend a series of large water changes to get all of the tank's parameters back in line. With calcium reactors, the issue is the opposite. When they fail, the media typically melts. Along with it, they dump in a ton of CO2. At this point, the pH plummets. If it's a couple tenths under 7.8, I'd open my home's windows to get fresh air into the house and aim my power heads at the surface of the water to promote gas exchange, which should correct it quickly. A handful of points below 7.8 and a balanced calcium and alkalinity additive like kalkwasser might get it up, but it's only going to compound the fact that your calcium reactor may have just poured a ton of calcium and alkalinity in as well. So test. Fact is, raising pH without raising alkalinity with an additive is almost impossible. Your options are really just promoting gas exchange with more flow, fresh outdoor air, CO2 scrubber media for your skimmer intake, which most people don't have on hand, and a large water change. Next disaster is temperature related, meaning that your home's air conditioning or furnace failed, hood fans, chiller, or your heater failed on or off. Overheating is the worst of the two because things go south fast at high temps. I'd say most tanks will do fine up to 83 degrees for sure, likely even 85 for a while. Past that is just a gamble of how much and how long the individual species can handle these temps. You're more or less just waiting for the first thing to die, which often causes a chain reaction throughout and you lose most of the tank. So if you see the tank is around 85, I'd drop it slowly, but if it's around 90, I'd make every attempt to get the temp down fairly rapidly, meaning a degree every 30 or so minutes. If your fridge makes ice with RO water, you can add the cubes directly to the tank. Otherwise, I'd put the cubes in a bag and float them. Be aware that it's likely going to take a lot of ice. Even a gallon of ice is pretty small when compared to the 100 gallons of tank water you're putting them into. Beyond that, I'd turn off every single piece of equipment that produces heat other than my return pump and power heads. Aim the power heads at the surface to promote evaporation, which releases a lot of heat as energy, as well as point a strong fan at the surface of the water to further promote evaporation. You can also crank up your home's air conditioning, which will help more than you might think. So what if your home's furnace failed or the heater breaks in the off position? And what about the tank getting too cold? Good news is your tank can likely handle this for a pretty long period of time. A lot of tanks can survive weeks or even longer at temps associated with typical home's ambient temperatures and heat generated from typical equipment. However, when you do get a new heater, don't try and raise the temp from 73 to 78 immediately. I'd walk it back up over the course of a few days. If the corals are showing signs of distress at the colder temp, consider going faster. If you don't have access to a new heater for some reason, consider cranking up the heat in the room itself, which will have the same effect. Next life support disaster is related to food. Let's say you knocked in an entire can of food into the tank or the automatic feeder went nuts. Well, short term, the biggest issue is ammonia is about to skyrocket because the bacterial system is not populated to handle 200 times as much food as you'd normally add in a day. If your tank survives, which most things might, the next issue is you just added 2 months worth of food in a single day, so you should probably expect to do the equivalent of 2 months worth of water changes in a single day as well. Personally, I would turn off everything, let it settle in the sand, and then siphon out as much as possible. Set my skimmer to skim as wet as possible, and change my filter socks frequently. I'd also keep a close eye on the ammonia, nitrate, and phosphate, and do water changes accordingly. You might even want to consider using an ammonia neutralizer as well. Really get as much of the food out as humanly possible, and then closely watch your levels afterward. If you bought a Senai primarily as a par meter before, this would be an awesome time to break it out and get real-time monitoring of the ammonia levels. Another critical life support failure is lighting, which can get stuck on or off. Again, it isn't that big of a deal. Corals can survive a long time without light, so unless it's been longer than a week, I probably wouldn't be that concerned. After that, I would probably acclimate the corals to a slightly lower light level or shorter photo periods over a week just to not shock them. Now let's say somehow the lights got left on for multiple days. The chances you're going to run into issues are pretty high, but most of them are going to be apparent almost immediately with the corals bleaching. At this point, I would likely turn the lights off for a day, then 25% of the photo period for a few days, 50 for a few days, and so on, just to give them a break. It's also theorized that iodine helps reduce free oxygen radicals within the coral's tissues that build up as a product of photosynthesis and may be one of the causes of bleaching. So I might consider dosing some iodine, which can be found at most local fish stores. The last critical life support system failure, which I guess is the most important because it holds everything together, is the tank itself. What do you do when it cracks or springs a leak? Again, each situation is different. A fast leak means you need to be concerned about your house and tank at the same time. If you have $20,000 floors, expensive furniture, and it's going to do $10,000 in damage to your home, that might be the priority for some. Others, the tank will be the number one above all else because they have adequate insurance. If it's a fast leak, grab anything you can to start pulling water out of the tank to put your fish and corals into, a sump or a plastic tub, anything that you can find, even metal if you have to. For the immediate time being, even a metal sink or bathtub is more reef safe than sitting them on the floor or the bottom of an empty tank. If the leak is slow, I'd go get a plastic horse trough or something similar and start moving everything over. Just to be clear, a leak is just a warning that it's going to get much worse fast or even fail catastrophically, which means that you need to be careful and solve fast, like as fast as possible. Remember that there's a few 100-pound piece of glass you're standing in front of with a couple 1,000 pounds of water and pressure behind it. If the seal fails completely, you do not want to be in its way or you're going to get hurt or even worse. I'm not a structural engineer, so my advice is limited on this, but I do think it's a bad idea to try and brace the tank with straps or clamps as well, because it'll only create pressure points, which could cause it to break as well. When you see a leak, the goal can only be to empty the tank quick before the problem gets worse. There's absolutely no reason to wait until it does. Last week we asked all of you what your favorite dip is, and Coral RX was the winner, with 1 in 5 of you also using Bear Insect Killer, which was pretty impressive. This week we're asking, what is the worst tank disaster you had to deal with? So hit that eye in the upper right hand corner and vote. Give us a quick thumbs up and subscribe to see next week's episode, week 51, Fish, Parasites, and Illness.